Hi, my name is Jessica Garson, and I'm here to talk with you about creating sample code. Let me know if this inspires you to create anything. You can reach out to me on Twitter. My DMs are open, and my handle is @JessicaGarson. And so what this talk is about how we were launching the V2 of the Twitter API, and we started off with this program called Twitter Developer Labs, which were previews of the new endpoints that later became our launching point for the new endpoints that we recently released, the V2 version of the Twitter API. And we are committed to partnering with developers to help create and shape the future of our API. And as we were working through this process, we were releasing new endpoints that no one had ever built with before. So therefore, they didn't have the same infrastructure as other endpoints that had, community-based libraries and a lot of different other resources that existed. They were brand new and nobody had ever seen them before. And so we had to create a series of sample code. But you might be wondering, what is sample code? So I like to think of sample code as code for other humans to use. It's similar to, example code or code and it's often code that you'll see in documentation. You might see it on a sample repository. Sometimes you'll see it for an open source library. But it's code for other people to use. And it's different from production code where you're building, code that's supposed to run a product or code for others to extend and build on top of. Sample code is actually created to help people accomplish very specific tasks by creating code that helps you get started with an API, typically, or a package or a library. Our sample code, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, is found on our GitHub repository. In particular, I'll be showing a few examples from the V2 version of our GitHub repository, which is github.com/twitterdev/Twitter API V2 sample code. Also, there is other sample code available just in our main Twitter dev repository. There are lots of different things that myself and other team members have been working on. We also have it in our documentation. And with the launch, we also launched some code-related resources. So we have a Postman collection, and Postman, for those who don't know, is a REST client that helps you make your first requests. And I think of that as also sample code because it can help you create your first requests. And then there's also an open API specification that we made available as well too, which can also be helpful as well if you want to build libraries or just kind of see our spec in more detail, or even just take a look at how things are made. And so, as we have been starting to create more sample code, there are some questions I like to ask myself as I'm creating sample code. So the first is, can you look at the code and know exactly what's going on? Some key questions to think about as you're going through it, is it readable? Is the code consistent? Does it does it help accomplish one goal in one language but another goal in a different language? For example, let's say you had a JavaScript version of the code that went through a different process to getting a JSON payload as a Python version, which exported everything into a CSV file. That would be very different experiences, and so you want to make sure that your code is consistent with each other and also consistent with other code samples that you may have released in the past as well. I like to have my code lightly commented, so the code has some instructions and some things to help you kind of adjust and have it meet your needs, but it's also very readable as well. The variable names also are explanatory, and it has a good README. So therefore, you can actually make sure that there are directions and documentation around how you would use it and what steps you need to take before you use it and any setup instructions. With both code commenting and a README, it is important to make sure that it is lightly commented. And you might have heard me say that once before already in this talk. But by lightly commented, it's not like a million comments where it's harder to read the code, or your README is so long and has so many different directions that it's really intense to kind of get started because you have to go through so many different processes. It's simple and to the point, but yet easy to follow. So keep that in mind as you are creating sample code. Also, I like to think of good sample code as like building blocks and almost like that base layer of the block. And so one thing, especially, as you're going, I recently spoke at the Philly Python user group, and I created a code sample for that. And I used our filtered stream sample code and just built on top of it and extended it to meet the goals of the application that I was going to be presenting on. And I learned so much in that process from a developer empathy perspective of just, what it takes to build and extend off of it. Because I noticed a lot of things about the code sample, noticed some inconsistencies, noticed a lot just as I was using it in that way. And it's really helpful to kind of like see how developers will use it, because a lot of times people who are turning to your sample code are using it to figure out how to integrate it with their applications. And so seeing if you can actually build on top of it was a really great exercise in developer empathy. Also, how others will perceive your code. At Twitter, we spend a lot of time editing written documents, and we're moving towards giving the same attention to our code samples. Before we launched our V2 version of the Twitter API, we actually had a bug bash for all of our sample code, which was pretty great because we were able to give it the same attention that we actually give to larger engineering releases. A bug bash is where there's a series of tests, and you have two testers who will go through and take a look and see, like, is it working? Is it passing each test? And then from there, you can fix any bugs that may come up, like if there's weird errors that come up and things like that. So that's something that's was really exciting. We're also moving towards the possibility, and we're starting to explore the possibility of using automated testing for some of our code samples as well. And that's something we've considered as well. Also, just making sure that like your code is following the conventions that are established. I'm a Python developer, and I use Pylint, and I use Black for auto formatting. Love Black. Happy to talk with any of you about that. It makes my code look a little bit more polished just because it isn't auto-formatted. And so making sure that like you are following modern code conventions and also documenting that as well is really important. The next thing might sound kind of silly, but it's really important. Is the code sample working? As you're going through the process of creating sample code, you want to make sure that the code is easy to replicate without complicated setup, and make sure that it like ages well. I've written a lot of code, especially in the past year, that was working at the time and was really great, but no longer works, or the payloads have changed, or the libraries that it depended on have made updates, or there are newer, more exciting libraries that have come out that like accomplish the task in a different way. And so making sure that happens as well. Also, security vulnerabilities in libraries, different things that can come up as well, to just make sure that your code is aging well and working, and that you have a way to kind of quickly make changes if things do break, and that you're responsive as things are not working or as you notice things that are coming up. So you might be wondering, what does good sample code look like? And I have a few examples to talk with you about. So one thing that I like to think about is functions like paragraphs. And so I like my code to tell a story. And then I personally really like to like take a step back before I write sample code. And I'm like, okay, cool. So like, what is the tutorial that I'm going to write about the sample code? If I was going to write a tutorial, what are the things that need to be done? And then like write it down in a notebook, and then create code that matches all the tasks and kind of think about it like that. And my personal style of code tends to be very modular and like build on top of each other and then tie it together with a main statement, which I kind of like to think about as like a conclusion. So you have like your introduction, which is like your imports, then like paragraphs, which are each function, and then the conclusion that ties it all together is the main function. And so that's how I like to think about writing sample code. So let's take a look at an example that does that. We have this import requests, import OS, and import JSON, and those are the two things. I do have some like comments just to make sure that you have what you need to run it. And this is some sample code that we have for filtered stream inside of our sample code repository for V2. And this is for the sampled stream endpoint. And so from here, we want to authenticate. So we just want to pass in our environment variable token for our bearer token. We're going to want to create the URL for sample stream. And then we want to create the headers that we're going to pass in here. And then we're going to want to connect to the endpoint. And so there's some logic and an exception code that passes through. But basically in that function, that's where you're actually going to do the connection. And then we have this main for the conclusion, which sets a bearer token as just the auth function, the URL as create URL, headers as create headers. And then since it's a streaming endpoint, it's just going to want to keep running. So there's some logic around that. And yeah, that's a little bit about how I like to think about, creating functions like paragraphs. Simple and to the point. So what I mean by that is that I really like to make sure that my code is really straightforward. So I had a code sample that was originally about 190 lines, and I just kept on like slashing it and removing many lines until, it was as simple and to the point as possible. And so for those types of code samples, I like to remove any unnecessary complexity, so I can like maybe live code it at a talk. This particular sample that I'm about to show, I have live coded at the Chicago Python meetup, which was really fun, and ChiPy. And then I also live coded it at PyOhio as well. And so as I'm going through this process of doing it, I really wanted to ask myself, is like every line really needed? Does it have to be there? Can I get rid of it? And like, how can I make this as simple as possible so that I can like show this to others and they can follow along with what's going on? So this is actually a sample that is in R, but it runs your favorite Python package in R. So using a library called Reticulate. And so for that, I first wanted to install the packages, and then from here set my path to Python, create a virtual environment and use the virtual environment, and then import JSON, the Python libraries for JSON and requests, get tweets from a given handle, create the URL there, pass in the credentials, and then create a JSON payload and put it into a data frame using some R packages. So this is actually 38 lines, and it started out much, much, much longer. So that's an example of how to make, very simple code. And the point of this code sample was actually something that I can easily live code and talk about at a conference. And I really wanted it to be as simple as possible. You'll notice that there aren't any functions in this. And that's actually because this was mostly for a Python audience, but in R, I wanted to make sure that that was very specific to them. So I wanted to really be able to explain each line as I was creating it. And this example was made for those conferences as well. Another thing that I like to think about as well is customizing my exemptions. So one thing that is really interesting when you're creating try-except statements is that you have the ability to kind of create your own messages. So one thing that I noticed in the bug bash that I talked about earlier was that a lot of people were getting the same error when they tried to type in their credentials wrong. And I was like, oh, cool, I'll create a customized exemption. And that's something that I hadn't done before, but I thought was something that was really great. So this comes from our sample code for the new V2. And this is hitting the get tweets endpoint using OAuth 1.0. And so it creates this like pin authorization. And here, this is actually one of the longest code comments I think I've written in a long time. But you'll notice on line 26, there's this try exempt statement. And with that, we're first going to try to, get the request token. And at this point, this is where the code was failing when people would be typing in their wrong credentials. So what I did was I created an exemption that said there may have been an issue with your consumer key or secret, just in case others experience the same error again. So that is something that I added to try to make that a little bit more robust. Cool. So you might be wondering, like, what is the process that you use for writing sample code? Like, how do you even get started with this? And so the process that we use at Twitter is that we start off by creating the code, then we do a peer review, we iterate off of that, build, so we actually start to like build and then get feedback. And so the way that I kind of like to think about it is that, you start off with your draft of a new code sample, and then you get reviewers to think about like how can you break it. I try to be very specific in who I get. So a lot of times I'll try to get newer developers mixed with some experienced developers or people who know the language or endpoint really well. And then from there, I take their feedback and I take it seriously. And I also try to break it a little bit more. And then I try to build with the sample code that I've created and see what that's like. And then once we release it, we also would love to get feedback from the community. And, I've had a couple of like pull requests on samples that I've written where people have caught some things that we didn't catch through the peer review process, or just noticed something that we didn't notice, or sometimes had things break in very specific ways. So, being able to be open and receptive to that feedback has been really important. And I've learned a lot, as part of this process of creating sample code for first the labs endpoints and then the V2 versions. And most of all, it's the importance of Hello World. Like, one of the things that was really great for me about the first time that I ever worked with the Twitter API was that, I remember the first time I ever built a Twitter bot, and I was like, oh my God, my code is making this thing tweet. This is awesome. I'm making internet happen. I got so excited that I sent an email to a list of almost 2,000 people of women who were learning how to code in DC at the same time through this community program called Hear Me Code. I was like, oh my God, I built this thing. It's so exciting. And I remember that feeling, and I think about it often. And, trying to help others have that feeling as quickly as possible is really the goal of good sample code. And so really thinking about that, developers come from a lot of different places, and trying to make sure that you have code that can help get them there as quickly as possible is always good. Also, one thing I've learned this year in particular is that what is good today might not be good tomorrow. Code can change, and libraries can change, and conventions can change. And so really, code will break, and it might be working great one day and not so great because of changes that happen for many different reasons. And so keeping that in mind as well. And also, as I mentioned earlier, your code will be viewed by people from many different backgrounds and maybe viewed very differently by different groups of people. So really thinking about, how you can make code be as accessible as possible, following conventions from Ally, and also just thinking about ways that other people may perceive it, and trying to be as accessible as possible is also something that, I've been thinking a lot about recently. And really being open to feedback. A lot of times I'll read things about our code samples, and sometimes it's actually me who wrote the code samples on our Twitter community forums, or I'll see it on Twitter, or I'll be, talking with folks in the community, and just knowing, that code is always a work in progress, and being open and receptive to feedback has been really helpful in the process. So as we're talking about feedback, we're very open to it as a team at Twitter. So if there are code resources that you want to see, let us know. One particular example is when we first launched Labs, we did not launch any Node.js samples, and somebody wrote in and they were like, hey, please give us Node.js samples. And so we were able to create those pretty quickly. And you can give us feedback at twitterdevfeedback.uservoice.com. And we definitely want to hear from you what you want to see in terms of resources or even feature requests or anything like that. Just let us know. There's also some additional ways to get it to give us feedback as well. You can file an issue on GitHub. You can submit a pull request if you want to fix it yourself. We love pull requests. There have been some people that have really helped out in a big way by finding things that we didn't catch, by helping us make our code a little bit more robust, by changing some things. That is always acceptable, and I love it when that happens. So yeah, feel free to submit a pull request. Documentation feedback. On every documentation page, if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see a happy face or a sad face. And you can click on the sad face if you see things that need to be improved and let us know. And, we're definitely, we have just started releasing the first few endpoints of the Twitter API, and we're definitely learning as we move towards future launches. So we're definitely trying to learn from some of our past mistakes and move forward from there. So it's been really great to kind of be part of this journey. And also feel free to take a look at our code samples and even clone them and try them out yourself. And again, github.com/twitterdev/Twitter API v2 sample code is where most of the code that I talked about today lives. And also, I love to talk about sample code. If you're creating sample code and want to show me what you built, or want to ask me questions, or really anything, or want to talk about the Twitter API, or really just want to talk about Python, anything like that, let me know if this inspires you to create anything. My ad handle is at Jessica Garson, and feel free to reach out to me. You can also let us know at TwitterDev or on the Twitter community forums. And here's some other links that might be helpful as well. Again, twitterdevfeedback.uservoice.com. All of our sample code is found at TwitterDev or github.com/TwitterDev. You want to look at any code samples. And then you can also communicate with us via the Twitter community forums. Thank you so much, and have a great day.